Everyone, welcome back for the second episode of RCCSS Chats. For those of you who don't know, the RCCSS is the Royal College of Chiropractic Sports Sciences in Canada. This is the national governing organization for sports chiropractic in Canada. Today, super excited to have our second guest on RCCSS Chats, Dr. Andrew Robb. Once again, I'm also lucky to have Dr. Melissa Corso on this webinar. Mel, thanks in advance for all of your assistance.
No problem. So I'm just going to quickly go over how we're going to run the session. Similar to last time, it is a live session on Zoom, as you know, since you've already signed in. But we're going to be recording the presentation and uploading it onto YouTube and other social media platforms. So hopefully people who aren't able to join us live can check it out later. If you have any questions throughout the interview, just write them in the chat box. I'm going to be moderating the questions and try and kind of get them in if it's relevant at the time, or save them for the end when we have a little bit more time. And that's pretty much all I got.
All right. Now I'd like to introduce our guest, Dr. Andrew Robb. Dr. Robb is a graduate from Brock University, where he was also a member of the Canadian National Championship baseball team. He then attended the Canadian Memorial Chiropractic College and attained his postgraduate fellowship from the RCCSS. He currently resides in Kitchener-Waterloo and oversees high performance and therapeutics at a sports medicine practice called The Armory. Dr. Robb is published in a variety of scientific journals in the area of baseball biomechanics and shoulder injuries. Dr. Robb has also collaborated with various organizations, including the Canadian Athletic Coaching Center, American Sports Medicine Institute, and Major League Baseball. He's also a sports medicine consultant for regional, Ontario, OUA, NCAA, and professional baseball. Dr. Robb, thanks for participating in this chat.
Thanks for having me, guys. I'm looking forward to this.
All right, so the first thing I want to get into is about your clinic here. So I hear you have a pretty awesome clinic set up at the Armory. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, man. It's a multidisciplinary clinic, and with the intent of trying to get away from silos and make it transdisciplinary with a common language on how we approach high performance, but even just general population care. So for me, being the associate and sort of the director of therapeutics and high performance, it's the big rule that I have is creating a common language that everyone can understand and breaking down some of those perceived barriers that disciplines have about other disciplines. And it's been good in that regard, trying to create common ground for patients to understand. So it's been interesting, challenges obviously along the way, but nonetheless, it's one that, you know, I think the RCSS has developed us for.
Yeah. So what are some of those disciplines that you have working there alongside with you?
Well, we got the full gamut. Like, we got physio, we have sport chiro, we have athletic therapy, we have trainers, chiropodists, podorthists. We have two sport medical physicians, one that's a retired surgeon, lower extremity surgeon, and we have a PSW. So like we try to cover our basis when it comes to some of the high performance, and a naturopath. Sorry.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, seriously. Yeah. Plus some stuff that I wouldn't have expected to see.
Yeah, and you know what? It's, if you're going to provide comprehensive care, you got to tackle it from multiple angles. And I think the disciplines that I've just listed, you know, they do their jobs in an exceptional way that obviously, like, scope for us, we can only do so much. And it's been good in that regard.
So you had talked about creating that common language between different disciplines. How have you gone about doing that?
So, you know what, it's funny because it's, I made this comment years ago when I was in the residency, and it's, once you start to talk about evidence-based led conversations and understanding, that is the language.
Yeah.
Like, that trumps all discipline titles. What you want to call things, the vernacular is different, but the evidence-based theme is actually what now trumps a lot of ideology that's out there. and which in itself is a barrier, because it's not everyone is up to date. Not everyone is agrees, because they haven't read in depth on various topics. So the issue with the language is based on sort of your biases coming in, but also to your education levels. Like certain schools cover only so much. And the onus is always on the individual to sort of add that depth in the spectrum of knowledge. That is challenging when you get into a busy practice and you're trying to make a living. That sometimes, like, the last thing in your mind is trying to go through tables of contents and trying to stay up to date on things sometimes. But and for me, the work that we did as residents, you're really forced to sort of speak that language and develop that language, so to speak. Yeah. And I think that's where, like, one of my assets coming to the team was that. And it's just trying to condense it in a way that brings people together, but doesn't polarize them. Because sometimes, like, when you start talking about evidence-based, it can really sort of galvanize and sort of really affect how people go about things, and they feel threatened sometimes. And that's not the idea, but it's just because of the unknown understanding, and it's just not everyone is going to keep up, and that's the one expectation you have to keep in mind. And it's a frustration I have, because I try to stay up to date as best as I can in various areas, but not everyone's like that. And I think that's where part of the approach has to understand that rate of acquisition, if you will.
Yeah, fair enough. So do you guys hold rounds or just share articles between people, or what's kind of the
so up until recently, like, we were doing monthly rounds amongst the therapy group, and the intent on the curriculum, as I called it, was to provide a structure for the language, understanding sort of tissue dynamics versus tendon versus nerve versus muscle versus physiology. So that we understood the basis, the basic foundations, basic sciences, and then building from there. So it's obviously, this is only a startup company or clinic. It's only about three years old. So we've covered various topics, but it's just trying to keep everyone on par. And it's the rounds are a great way to do that. And it forces, like, I do a lot of them, but it really forces you to condense it into a format that people can use 5 minutes later when they go right into practice.
Yeah.
Right.
Cool. So I want to get into a little bit about what your day-to-day consists of. I mean, obviously you're treating people, but then there's a variety of other things. So what's that balance look like?
So a lot of it, like, when you take on a director role, there's a lot of managerial duties that are not necessarily clinically relevant at times. And for me, it's keeping the young practitioners sort of apprised to things, whether it be sort of policy and procedures, especially right now with everything's going on. But also too, just like, keeping a cohesive network amongst our group. And the idea is that it's create a community, right, that creates and breeds a culture. And it's with new people coming on and different knowledge gaps, that sometimes is always a challenge, but it's something there that's usually part of the day. And then it's just like with any high profile athletes that we have, we start to review, okay, like, where are they at? What are we doing? And what's next on the agenda of things. And then obviously I have my day where it's like, I see my patient roster itself, but that's a typical day. And there's obviously spot days in the month where it's like I've got other duties to sort of manage, but for the most part, it's right now anyways, it's pretty smooth as we speak. So in that regard, it's it's good.
Cool. Dr. Corso, I'm going to let you chime in there.
Okay.
Yeah, we actually had a question from one of the viewers, and they were just wondering what type of resources you use in order to stay up to date on the various topics that you choose.
So for me, the one strategy that I picked up on as a resident was I subscribe to a lot of table of contents, and I narrowed down to certain keywords. So that way it's in areas of my interest more specifically, but that is one strategy. The second one, it was these multi-use databases like MD Links, QuickMD, that really give you a vast spectrum of table of contents and topic areas. I do that a lot. So I get inundated daily on a lot of abstracts and lists to stay apprised of things. And sometimes it's more to archive future readings, but also too, it's to stay apprised of things also too, it has to come up with a strategy. And part of it is there's so much out there that you've almost got to, like I said, creating that strategy, partly becomes what you see on a day-to-day basis. So that way the information stays relevant. But the other part to it as well is like there are knowledge gaps that I have a list, an ongoing list. And I'm constantly like archiving, okay, like, you know, where am I at? Am I chipping away at my list? Not naive to think that just because I've been out so many years that I have a good grasp of things. I do, but honestly, I don't. And it's, and I'm trying to sort of make sure that I cover my basis. And sometimes my knowledge gaps are not necessarily clinical, right? Some of it is or personal development versus managerial leadership based content, and it's just based on the roles that I'm in and sort of what I'm doing. Also comes into play on that. So like there's multiple strategies, but it's just like, what's your list, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's one of those things that it's kind of like the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. So that list just keeps on growing and growing.
Yes, it's that incomplete theory, right?
Yeah.
So that it's but it's humbling, but also too, it's the more time you spend in various areas, you become well versed enough to accept your knowledge gaps because you have enough a breadth of a knowledge in a certain area. And I think that's the other part that I try to keep in mind as well, and it's something for the younger practitioners as well, is that you've got to read the bad research, right? It's everyone reads the latest and greatest and the good research, but it's only good research if you actually know what the bad is, or the stuff that is contrarian, or it's like it's lacking some validity of some sort. And that's the part there that we spend, like, I'll go back to the rounds comment. I spend time on that topic, things that would be sort of contradict our topic of the day. You need to understand that stuff. And a lot of times that's where people get into trouble, right? And it's, you've got to read both sides of the coin when it comes to topics, right? And people don't want to. And you're led and you're biased because of that. Systematic reviews can do that sometimes too, because it's the best stuff that fits a model. But sometimes reading the other stuff actually gives you some merit and some relevant information. All right. So it's a key point to remember for those trying to do research.
Yeah, it kind of gives you the context, right? Like it gives you the whole conversation.
Absolutely.
So I'm just going to kind of go on to our next question here. And in your bio, you mentioned some pretty significant collaborations. So what kind of roles do you play when you collaborate with different organizations? So we mentioned things like the Canadian Athletic Coaching Center, the American Sports Medicine Institute, and the Major League Baseball.
The background on that. So some of the collaborations that I've been a part of it has been with the intent of being, I use the term loosely, a content expert in various areas. And it's the idea is that with the Canadian Athletic Coaching Center, that role was more of as a therapist and conducting a lot more. And back then, this is going back to 2007, 2008-ish, around that time period, doing a lot of movement, which was not necessarily a big thing It was just coming into its infancy at that point. I was doing a lot of that work because a lot of therapy at the time was more orthopedic based. And with the influences of like Larry Bell and a lot of the movement work that was coming out at the time, there was an opportunity for me to really sort of step into a different role as a therapist and give a different perspective for the athletes. The other two were more to do with baseball because that's like near and dear to me. And one of my mantras when I went into the residency was I wanted to be involved with baseball at the highest level. And my research that I did as a resident was that stepping stone. Academically, I have a platform, a voice, and an opportunity and window to actually now sort of pursue various ventures with the American Sportsmen Institute. They were doing research and they were taking research interns. So for me, it was just like, that was a no-brainer, right? The hub for all baseball research at the time allowed me to act as a researcher, which was a different role than as a therapist. And I put on a different hat, which again, I praise the residency for it. It prepared us very well for me to hold my own amongst various researchers, but also to leaders in baseball at the time with James Andrews, Kevin Wilk, and Glenn Fleisig. So it's like having that strong research background allowed me to be part of that group. And then with baseball, that was interesting because it wasn't necessarily as a therapist, but it was as a consulting therapist in the sense that they were asking for ideas on like perspectives on how to treat and what to look for. And then other opportunities with the Diamondbacks, for example, I was actually as a researcher, and it was based off of research that I did as a resident. So the idea was, okay, I want to be baseball. I'm doing research as my key to get through the door. And there was teams that bought into that science because it was a knowledge gap in the baseball world at the time. And it was the right timing, right? And being a therapist, I get the mindset of a therapist. So when you're going in as a researcher, it's an easier conversation to have because you sort of understand the thought process a little bit more than it would be if it was just strictly researchers. So, and also being a former player, like I sort of get where they get lost in the mix between researcher, testing, and therapy sometimes. So it was unique in that regard with Major League Baseball. And but again, it was just because of the research, the quality of the research that I was able to produce, which I was fortunate to do, that allowed those collaborations.
Cool. One of the things when we were chatting previously is that your current interest is in baseball development from a pediatric exercise prescription perspective.
Yeah.
Can you expand a little bit more on what that means?
Yeah. So here's an analogy for you, and this is what I get a lot in some of the experienced practitioners, even for yourselves. I get a lot of coaches and parents coming to me and asking, like, can I get a throwing program? And like, the answer is yes, no to that. But the idea is that it's like asking for a practice exam for the final exam, and all you do is the practice exam to get ready for the finals. That's what a lot of athletes and parents and coaches do now. They don't understand the actual kid, the system that's in front of them, to know, okay, maybe I shouldn't give you a throwing program. Maybe I should give you some other work to do to develop you, so that way we can do sport-related work or exercise, drills, whatever it may be. So looking back and being around it now, seeing what's done at major league level, what's done at the college level, and being a pitching coach with Waterloo at the OUA level, and seeing what goes on the grassroots level, you can see why arm problems do occur. It's not due to lack of effort from kids. It's not due to a lack of throwing programs and whether or not they're prescribed better than others. One of the key things that I came to realize is that coaches do a really good job of developing IQ for their game and being great tacticians when it comes to game strategy. But when you ask them about how to develop a 13-year-old who's going through a growth spurt and they may still have exposed or unfused growth plates, what should their training look like? They can't answer that question, right? Partly because of the training and it's just beyond their scope sometimes. But at the same time too, though, these coaches, they, in some respects, neglect that area. So that whole side of physiology. And I spend more time now educating coaches and associations in this region about sort of, okay, under the age of 14, this is the profile, the physiological profile of your athlete. After 14, this is what they start to develop into, right? So that's just on a basic, purely exercise physiology level, right? Basic science. You can't talk about long-term athletic development process if you don't actually understand the physiology and how an athlete develops to begin with. Like, you just can't go through those phases. And I'm trying in this region, trying to get the associations to get on board with this form of a long-term athletic process. So that way we can produce better athletes, but have a concept of physical literacy, but also too, like, we can actually produce better ball players with less arm problems, almost make myself obsolete in a sense from a therapy side, but become more of a consulting or an advocate on the education. And it's because coaches don't get it. And it's what gets to me is when I speak on a lot of the physiology, and this is where I got frustrated. The number of kids that I know that throw 90 miles an hour, you give them a baseball and I ask them to explain to me how they produce 90 miles an hour when they throw. Majority of them, if not all of them, cannot answer that question.
Yeah.
So, and here's my point to it. If you don't know how to throw 90 and you have an arm problem, what are we rehabbing? Like, the rehab part, like the physical aspect of the UCL repairing, sort of any tendon issue, that stuff's easy. But what are we going back to after the tissue is capable of actually tolerating loading, going back to sport-specific rehab? So I'm trying to understand, like, what are coaches doing, or kids, athletes / parents doing or not doing, or understand that would make the process that much easier. And my concept that I use this summer is, like, don't waste bullets. If you're throwing to develop the arm, like, we got problems. Right? There's other things that you can do that are more effective, that the science would actually provide a better understanding on how to develop an athlete than actually just throwing a baseball.
Right.
Right.
And so would some of those things be like getting them to play other sports, or is that more like gym dedicated time? What kind of builds that athlete?
Yeah, so prime example. So kids under the age of 14, the number one predictor, there's two predictors for better skill acquisition in the long term is leg power and movement coordination, right? So recent systematic reviews suggest that Winters in 2019. So if you understand that those two things there, coordination and leg power, they can easily be developed, play another sport, be active, be physically active, versus, okay, you know what, we can't be as physically active just because of the state of affairs right now. Okay, so you have some stuff to do at home, or facilities are starting to open up and practice. Okay, this is where now you can get into some drill work, right? Some speed strength work, some agility based work, very basic drills that will develop the system more effectively than you just trying to throw more baseballs. Right? The point is that, and what I'm trying to educate the coaches on, is that throwing a baseball is the actual test to the prep work and the development work that you're doing. So if you develop the athlete properly and you've done appropriate, age-appropriate exercise and development, sport itself becomes easier. Skill acquisition becomes exponential. A, or B, it's actually retained, which I find more of an interest, because a lot of these kids, they spend all this time doing workouts in the off season, they go on throwing programs, they play their competitive seasons, and they can't retain the skill very well. And velo, of ball velocity, the hallmark to speed acquisition is you retain the ability to throw at a previous speed. And if it drops and you lose it, you can't get faster if you can't keep what you already have.
Yeah.
So, and there's a physiology side to, like, how do I train an athlete to actually now move fast, right? Let alone throwing a baseball fast. And that's where I've got a lot of coaches and players understanding that concept. And it's taken time, but that's where the science comes into play, right? And you show the stats, and you sort of show them, like, convention. If convention worked, every kid would throw 90 coming out of high school, but we don't have that, right? So
yeah, it's that change in understanding from valuing the process and valuing the outcome, or a lot of people really focused on that outcome.
Totally. And part of it too is that I don't fault coaches, parents, or the athletes necessarily, but everyone wants to feel comfortable with doing what is socially accepted. Oh, Driveline does this in the US, or this guy, like, he plays Major League Baseball, they do this.
Yeah.
But when you start to, like, just do sprint work, do med ball toss, right? Do battle ropes as basic, conditioning exercises that don't necessarily seem conventional, but have high effective purpose. People like, nah, I don't know if I want to do that, right? So there's that dogma, but also to this, the social influences that social media brings to the table that also challenges things as well.
For sure. So what are some of those common injuries that you're seeing in baseball players?
Oh man, it's you know what, it's that's a loaded question. So early on, like, basically the primary injury that I see, I categorize it as biomechanical tissue overload syndrome. So it's not a tear. There's imaging isn't sufficient enough to detect anything, but on clinical exam, focal tenderness, weakness, soreness, whatever it may be, weakness in patterns. I see that a lot, and primarily in the shoulder and the elbow. So obviously in throwers, that's the hallmark injury profile. But they're overload-based issues. And the question you ask yourself, is that because of dysfunctional overreaching, or is that due to functional overreaching? Because then you can go backwards on that. If it's dysfunctional overreaching, okay, were you just throwing too much? A, or B, is it the fact that your training didn't match your throwing process? And I find that is a bigger issue than anything else, versus the functional overreach is, okay, the volume, intensity, distance is increasing, part of the program, but you started to break down. That breakdown may not be actually a bad thing. That actually might lead itself into the next phase in your training. So trying to understand what teams and coaches are doing will influence some of the work that you do there. But so the biomechanical overload is primarily the most common. When I see tears of the rotator cuff, labral tears as well, typically those are the collegiate athletes, high-end elite throwers that typically throw hard, and I've logged a lot of miles. And part of that is their training may not have kept up with the demands of the next level. UCL, I see that on a spectrum anywhere from 17 to about 23. Typically, again, the elite thrower who throws hard, logs a lot of innings, does a lot of showcases, like your typical profile that a lot of the research would suggest. The rare incidents, I will see some neuropathies, and those are typically those who are very hypermobile, I find. Even with the TOS, the more vascular TOS, those are the kids that they have that hyper mobility syndrome, like that 3 to 4 out of 9 on the Beighton scale. They are exceptionally mobile, and they run the risk of injuring non-sort of skeletal tissue. And I find that they're challenging to work with because of the fact that you need to produce some stiffness in their sort of motion. And some of the other injuries, like the hip and lower extremity, I see less now than I have done in probably the last 4 or 5 years. just because I was known as a hip guy when I first got into baseball in this region, so everyone did hip work. So I don't see that too much anymore, but it's still there. But amongst the throwers, it's typically upper extremity. It's not so much the injury that concerns me. It's the mechanism or sort of the profile leading up to the breakdown that is the issue, right? Because as I said earlier, like tissue is easy to address and treat because you're tied to timelines that are out of your control. It's more to do with recovery time, workload management, training that leads up to throwing. And I find that it's the training side is if you follow the force velocity curve, most do not actually follow that curve. They spend a lot of time, potentially they skip phases. They go from strength down into speed strength very quickly, and they go right into sport, and there's no transitions. Mm-hmm. And the tissue doesn't accommodate, and the nervous system just like it gets fried with volume. So the other injury I would say is actually that functional or more so the dysfunctional overreaching that I find with athletes. Because then that's like lifestyle based work that I got to sort of now educate these kids on: sleep, nutrition, lifestyle management in terms of other sports, and sort of when to go to practice, should you go to a game, how much should you pitch, things of that nature. So, excuse me.
You're also known as one of the movement guys. Are there typical movement patterns that you're seeing in baseball players?
Yeah, it's when I look at it, it's like for me, it's a different profile in this region because some of the influence I've had on teams and what they are already doing in the off seasons versus somebody else in another region. And I say that strongly because it's when I was in spring training, one of the things I noticed with some of the teams I was working with, I saw different profiles. The profile that comes out inherently is obviously how players are scouted and selected, but it's also the philosophy or the sort of concept that the therapy, medical, rehab staff advocate for the athletes. So you're going to see differences, right, from one team to another, from position to position. But for me, on that end, typical patterns that I see are the rotation centers are a problem. So when I say rotation centers, I'm talking about the hip joints, thoracic spine, and the shoulder. And typically I'm seeing rotation deficits, and it's random. So it could be left hip versus right hip. Trunk, typically it's in the direction they throw, but not necessarily all the time. It could be a 50-50 split. The shoulder, typically it's more of the GERD phenomena. But again, I can have the deficit into external rotation as well. So those are the typical joint profiles, the movement or the sort of the chain profiles, if you will. I find that the athletes move relatively well, i.e. less tension or passive torque as it's called, in the opposite direction to the way they throw. So for a right-hander, it's in the cocked position going back versus their direction that they throw into. So, and part of that is, and it gets tricky sometimes, and I've been fooled at various points, but anytime that you're looking at movement, especially with from a clinical perspective, and it's conducted quickly, your therapy exam will never reach speeds that they actually produce in sport. So that passive torque, and I use that term strongly, the passive torque that is inherent in that tissue because it's built up, it's thickened because of the repetitive use, may elicit a lack of range or a deficit in that range when in fact it's actually fine. It's just the tissue is built up. We know that with, and there's no real science to sort of support other than the posterior capsule thickening, but we know that in runners that whole fascial posterior chain is thicker in a runner than it is in a non-runner. because of the nature and the repetitive nature of what they do. So in throwers, I'm inferring and surmising on sort of, okay, well, they'll probably have that sort of type of adaptation as well on the side that they throw into, more on the posterior side. The other thing that I find as well as a pattern issue is more to do with, and categorically you can call it a spiral line, I guess, for a lack of a better description, but the adductor inner hamstring is usually a problem. Very rarely is it trained well, and a lot of the inner hamstring adductor magnus specifically, they control a lot of pelvic stability, a lot of hip motion in a wide stance. Baseball is played wide. You throw into a lunged position, you hit into a lunged position, you're running, which is a lunge, but those wide stances bias the inner hamstring and adductor mag, which has influences on dynamics to the trunk itself. So I find that trunk deficits in rotation and even into extension a lot of the times is associated, I'm finding, with some of the under-recruited or rate of force development lower in sort of the inner hamstring and groin.
Okay. One other thing I wanted to get to on the baseball topic is, how do you know, like, what is baseline? What do you want to get back to? What's normal and abnormal? How do you make that decision? Because that's a difficult thing to decide. I mean, baseball is such a asymmetrical sport that you have that challenge of, is this a positive adaptation that's going to make this a better player, or is this something that's going to lead to injury?
Yeah, it's I think my approach to it is, it depends on the time of year. So if you're in season, beginning, middle, or the end, part A. Part B is, are you in off season and there's less baseball, versus you're gearing up for baseball season. So you're almost into a preseason, spring training type of scenario. My intents will be different upon evaluation. So in season, what I'm looking for is as an abundance or full range that you have available in the primary rotation centers, right? Hips, trunk, and shoulder. What's normal? Well, whatever you have available, right? So obviously we have normative data for pediatrics and adults. I'll use that as a frame of reference. But pitchers typically exceed normal general population normative values. So I just ensure that you have an abundance through there, number one. Number two is, in terms of symmetry, if you are healthy and it's mid to late season and there isn't a reason to be concerned, I will leave you alone, right? Just because range is off and there's no other indicator to, like, from a therapy standpoint, to address it and release it and have full available range comparable to the other side, yeah, maybe not, right? Like, remember, and you alluded to it, like, sport provides an adaptation that, is it performance enhancing or not? Well, if there's no issues and they're throwing at an elite level, should you? It's debated, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I do with my athletes is, when they go to train, I evaluate passive range and resist range dynamometry pre and post throwing. And what I do is, okay, what range do you have before practice? That is typical. So you need multiple data points to make it reliable. So if I'm seeing you on a weekly basis, I will take your ranges passively, what's available. I will then look at resisted testing to see, okay, what are you producing relative to your body weight? So I normalize it to you. And then I make you throw, or I don't make you throw, but part of the program, if you're throwing, is then I will look at, what was the consequence of training, right? So we always talk about range and having competency, having full, and having the ability to reach end range. But what is the acute effect after training to that range, right? And it's the one thing that I try to educate my throwers on is the currency for velocity, the currency for speed, the currency for adaptation will always be range of motion. So are you losing it? If you are, why? Is it we overtrained today? Is it you didn't prepare properly? What's the variable, and like what's your profile? So that way, when it comes to normatives, if I've tested you 10 times and I know your external rotation is 134 degrees, right? And all of a sudden today it's at 121. Okay, did you do your prep work, right? Did you warm up adequately? What was your throwing prep? How many pitches at high intensity did you do? Any technical issues that we were having to deal with? Where are you at with your S&C work? So it gives me an idea of not so much the normative, it's not the end range, it's the process by which range can actually break down. Yeah. That I can manage, because you can't control how much range you have necessarily. You can control the process. So I'm trying to control variables in the process that might have an influence. And then once I know what triggers you, that's what I emphasize. That's my normal, so to speak. All right. Because as I said, like the only way you get faster is if you keep previous speed. Speed is based on range and a lot of it. Right. So, so that's it, sort of the approach I have there. I don't have set numbers. I try to avoid that at all costs. We are in an analytic world right now with a lot of stuff in baseball with spin rates, vertical breaks, horizontal breaks, adding more numbers into kids' heads. They start chasing numbers, and we're creating lab rats, and that can't compete, right? And that's a big concern when I've talked to a lot of coaches in the U.S. That are D1, even D2s, like they're struggling with these kids that can't actually manage a game. But they'll tell you every analytical number that they have, from range right down to the exact spin rate that they have on a slider versus a fastball, right? But they can't throw 3 straight strikes and produce a ground ball. Like,
well, the University of Waterloo is pretty lucky to have you. We're going to move on to next section here called Next Question. Basically, we're just looking for fast responses, yes, no, one-word type answers. So to start off, where did you grow up?
Guelph, Ontario.
What age did you start playing baseball?
10.
When you were a kid, what did you want to do when you grew up?
Be a Blue Jay.
Perfect. What position did you play in baseball?
I was a third baseman, converted to a pitcher in college.
Cool. How early in your career did you begin focusing on baseball? I think we already got that one.
Yeah.
Do you miss being a clinician at CMCC?
Oh, geez. 100% yes.
Who's your favorite baseball team?
Blue Jays. I bleed blue, brother.
Are there any other sports that you really enjoy watching or playing?
I don't mind running. Yeah, and the other one is I don't mind the throwing field events.
Yeah.
Javelin, track, and hammer throw and discus.
Who's been your favorite athlete to work with so far?
I got 2, if I can. Alex Nolan, he's an OUA kid out of Brock University that cracked the barrier. He's playing with the Jays. Probably the most successful OUA pitcher or athlete to play pro. So he's on quite a ride right now. So definitely it's proud of that guy. The other one, probably my most favorite athlete of all, girl from Aurelia, Ontario, Time Thompson. She was a T7 complete a spinal cord injury. This girl has defied all odds and never complained once, ever, in the 2 years that I worked with her. So, so those 2.
Awesome. Last question. What's your go-to Red Bull flavor?
My God, I don't have one. Oh, geez.
That was from one of your athletes.
Yes. I think I know who that is. Okay.
So what are the next steps for you, Dr. Robb?
My next steps. Currently, right now, I'm working on a project. It's called M1 Performance Systems. It's for throwers, not just baseball. Like I just mentioned earlier, I'm working with a lot of high level javelin, discus, and hammer throw. So it's working on a system of developing athletes who want to throw. So I'm in the process of working on that. As well as some stuff with trying to with one of my guys working in Major League Baseball, trying to work with a lot more and building the roster of MLB guys. So, which will probably be next winter.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to open up the floor to see if there's any audience questions here, and then we'll finish things up after that. So Mel, if there have been any along the way.
Okay.
Okay, so I have a question from Luke, and he says, from a positional perspective,
Yeah.
how often do you see catchers with shoulder issues as they are consistently throwing, although with a slower velocity, but the repetition and volume is there, and they play more frequently than pitchers?
I find that with catchers, yes, they do have the arm problems. But I find that catchers typically are one of the more athletic players on the field. So when they break down, one of the concerns I have is it's not so much the arm that is an issue, it's more to do with the lower half. And it's because they spend so much time in a crouched or squat position that over time, depending on where their conditioning is at, they start to lose leg power. And as a result, because most of the catchers are typically one of the stronger kids on the field, they will start muscling their throws, and you start to see effort to produce velocity, not momentum producing velocity. So I find that with catchers, yes, they throw more than most on the field, if not everyone on the field. They don't necessarily have to throw with a dedicated program necessarily. They can, especially if their arm speed isn't up to par, but they got to do more conditioning on the lower half to complement the arm itself. So it's more to do with managing workload for throwing and more to do with conditioning in the lower half than anything else.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions?
All right, that seems like probably a pretty good place to finish things up there. Dr. Robb, thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining us tonight. That was a pretty awesome session.
Yes,
it'll take a little while to digest some of the information that you just spit out there.
Yeah.
If people do want to know more from you, what are some of the best ways for them to stay up to date with you?
You know what? Shoot me an email. Obviously, like my social media presence is low right now. It's a bit of an old school guy, but feel free to shoot me an email if there's content or clarifications people want. Feel free to. I don't have any problems with that. My email can be sent out. Chris, I don't have any problems with that. And then you can find us at thearmyclinic.ca. If you want to reach out to me, or if you need to find me for any reason, by all means.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone who attended, and we'll see you again soon.